Right.
Good morning. Welcome to We Stand on Their Shoulders, a history of Wisconsin women and voting. This is Ayda Murray. I'm on the Plato lecture team, and we're going to wait just a couple minutes before we take you live so you can see me, and we'll get into the lecture in just a minute. We're so glad you could join us today. It's a good day to reflect on what's happened, what the wonderful and courageous and brave women all over the country, but particularly here in Wisconsin, did to make it possible for me to drop my ballot in the mail a couple weeks ago. So I think it's a really relevant issue and very timely for us to focus on what did happen 100 years ago as a lead up to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. So thank you for being with us, and we'll get going just a second here. If you have questions and answers, questions anyway, we hope we'll be able to provide the answers. We'll do that mostly at the end of Laurel Miller's presentation, because she will talk to you initially, and then we'll show a video of the exhibit produced by the Wisconsin Historical Society to celebrate the 100th anniversary, which just seems incredible that it took that long, only 100 years ago, for women to actually have the right to drop a ballot in the mail or vote in person. So I think maybe we want to open up the lecture now. Trish?
Okay. I will hide us.
All right. Hello.
Hi, are you ready for me to start my introduction?
Well, just a sec before we do that, I want to thank Trish Yacarino, who is always such a good friend and supporter of the Plato Lecture Committee. And she's with us, and she will be, as I said, providing the questions to you at the end, Laurel. Again, we are so glad that you could be here to do this important lecture on women and the right to vote. So let me introduce you formally. This is Laurel Miller, who is the Group Experience Coordinator at the Wisconsin Historical Museum and part of the education team for the last 3 years. Laurel holds an undergraduate degree in modern history from the University of St. Andrews and an MA in European history from UW-Madison. I want to say, I hope everybody that's registered enjoyed the photo of you and your cat Cookie, who has already attempted to join the lecture. So that may occur. Oh, well done. Good to have a good little laugh. So Laurel, take it away and let us hear what the Wisconsin Historical Society has produced.
All right, and thank you so much, Ayda. I am so excited to be here today. And thank you, everybody watching, for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to sharing with you some of the story of the women's suffrage movement in Wisconsin. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the ancestral land of the Ho-Chunk Nation. The Ho-Chunk have called this place home since time immemorial. The exhibition, We Stand on Their Shoulders, opened at the beginning of 2020 at the Wisconsin Historical Museum in Madison. We opened it to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. Unfortunately, due to the current COVID situation, our museum has been closed to the public since March. But we're really excited to be able to share our exhibition with you today through a virtual tour. So until further notice, we will be closed to the public, but hopefully when things open up again, you will be able to maybe come visit us and see the exhibition in person. Here in Wisconsin, we've actually been celebrating the suffrage centennial since June of 2019, because that was the anniversary of when Wisconsin ratified the 19th Amendment. In 2019, the Wisconsin Historical Society created a pop-up exhibit on women's suffrage, which toured the state. We also did a series of lectures and educational programs for schools. And then from June 2019 until the end of the year, the pop-up exhibit was installed in the rotunda of the Capitol building. In January, we opened the full exhibition, We Stand on Their Shoulders, at the Wisconsin Historical Museum, with all of the photos and artifacts and documents from our collections, many of which have never been displayed in public before. One of the artifacts that has never been displayed before that I especially wanted to draw attention to was the 1846 draft of Wisconsin's state constitution. This is sort of the expanded version of the Constitution draft, which was then voted on and narrowed down before Wisconsin became a state in 1848. And a really notable thing about the 1846 Constitution is that one of the early proposals included both women's suffrage and African-American suffrage. Both of these were voted down and they weren't included in the final 1848 Constitution. However, one piece of the story that is often left out is that there was another referendum in 1849, so just a year later, where the majority of voters approved suffrage for African-American men in Wisconsin. And yet, although legally they had the right to vote after that, election officials prevented Black men from actually casting their votes until 1866, when a man named Ezekiel Gillespie from Milwaukee successfully sued for his right to vote. And this is a story, a pattern that we'll see repeated over and over again, where different groups of people are legally granted suffrage, but in practice, they're still prevented from exercising their right to vote. We're now 100 years on from the passage of the 19th Amendment, and we have a lot to celebrate and commemorate about the fight for women's suffrage. At the same time, it's important to acknowledge that the women's suffrage movement did not guarantee voting rights for everyone. Many of the women involved in the movement did not advocate for women of color, nor were women of color included in the suffrage efforts. African-American women like Harriet Tubman, Mary Church Terrell, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and Ida B. Wells were just as passionate as white suffrage activists, but their stories and the impact they had are often excluded from the narrative. I also want to acknowledge that the great majority of American Indians did not receive full US citizenship until the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. This act was passed largely in recognition of the many Native Americans who served their country during World War I. And although the Indian Citizenship Act technically gave Indigenous men and women the right to vote, many states used other means to deny American Indians their voting rights until well into the 20th century. The last state to fully guarantee suffrage to Native Americans was Utah in 1962. Finally, when we talk about the lead up to the Civil Rights Act of 1965, we usually focus on the unjust voting restrictions placed on Black voters in the southern states. But it's important to note that right here in Wisconsin, Black voters have historically been denied equal access to the polls, although often through less explicit means, like gerrymandering districts. Milwaukee in particular is one of the most segregated cities in the United States, and it has been for over a century. And segregation and unequal voting rights do tend to go hand in hand. So I know that's a lot of information right up front at the introduction, but it's really important to place the women's suffrage movement in the context of the larger history of voting rights in Wisconsin and in the United States, especially now that we have 100 years to reflect back on. That was one of the main objectives for our curators and archivists in putting together the exhibition, We Stand on Their Shoulders. We really wanted to go beyond just the passage of the 19th Amendment and bring the story up to the present day. The tour that you're about to experience is going to be given by Simone Munson of the Wisconsin Historical Society's Library and Archives Division. Simone was part of the team that developed the exhibition. She did a great deal of the archival research, and she identified the key documents to display in the exhibition. Simone Munson is the Collection Development Coordinator for the Wisconsin Historical Society. She supervises the acquisition of collections for the library and archives. Simone earned a master's degree in history from the University of New Mexico and a master's in library and information sciences from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And she currently lives in Black Earth with her family. I'm so delighted to have this opportunity to share Simone's work with you today and give you a peek inside the exhibition. So without further ado, I'm going to switch it over to Simone and our tour of the exhibition, and I hope that you will all enjoy. Thank you.
Welcome to We Stand on Their Shoulders. This is the commemorative exhibit designed by the Wisconsin Historical Society to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. We Stand on Their Shoulders is a quote that was said by Val Phillips in a speech that she gave in 1914 and was meant to invoke the idea that the women who came before us, all those suffrage leaders that came before her, made it possible for her to be where she was today and to advocate for a suffrage amendment. 1914 was still a few years off from achieving the amendment, but Val Phillips knew that the movement was gaining ground and that it was an eventuality that they hoped would happen for women across the country. The archivists and curators of the Wisconsin Historical Society really liked this quote as we were designing the exhibit because it not only allowed us to talk about women's suffrage and to look back on the past 100 years of voting rights, but also to acknowledge that with the passage of the 19th Amendment, there was still a lot more work that needed to be done with regards to voting rights and how women engaged with politics. So we designed the exhibit with those things in mind. So come on in and we'll show you around to see how we talk about voting rights and suffrage for the last 100 years. So when you first enter the exhibit, you're greeted by two things. One is a suffragist in a Wisconsin suffrage tunic in bright yellow. This is a tunic that Wisconsin suffragists wore to the Republican National Convention in 1916 in Chicago. Wisconsin suffragists, along with suffragists from around this country, went to Chicago to march down the streets of Michigan Avenue to let the Republican Party know that they were there and they were going to be seen and they were an important force to be reckoned with. The other thing that you're greeted with is a ballot box behind plexiglass. This is the ultimate goal that women were trying to attain. This ballot box was used in 1915 up in Clark County, Wisconsin, and was used to collect ballots securely so that they could be counted after the election was over. It's a repurposed box and at one time it held axe handles. So these are sort of the two images that you see when you enter the exhibit, and they really do sort of sum up what the exhibit is about, what the suffrage movement was going towards. It's these women who are fighting to get the right to vote. So oftentimes I'm asked, how did the suffrage movement start? Where did it begin? And it's a really interesting question. Abigail Adams, when her husband John Adams was going to Philadelphia to draft the Constitution, she urged her husband, don't forget the women, and hoped that they would be kind to women and give them certain rights. Now we know that in the Constitution they didn't include the right to vote for women, but really there's been some talk of women's suffrage ever since the foundation of our country. In Wisconsin in 1846, when we're drafting our first state constitution, there is the question of women's and African American suffrage that is raised during the Constitutional Convention. And ultimately, they do not include women and African American suffrage in the 1846 Constitution. And that's a failed constitution, and eventually Wisconsin ratifies its constitution in 1848, and that does not include women's suffrage in it either. So the origin of the movement is different for different states, for different places and groups. One of the big events that happens that's seen as the start of the modern suffrage movement is the 1848 convention at Seneca Falls, New York. This was a 2-day conference where women and abolitionists gathered to talk about the rights of suffrage, not just women's suffrage, but African American suffrage and universal suffrage in general. And the first day was focused on women's suffrage, and only women were allowed to attend the convention on the first day. And then on the second day, they invited men to come to the convention as well. Because the suffragists were smart. They realized that in order to get the right to vote, they didn't have to convince themselves that it was important. They had to convince the men of this country that women's suffrage was an important issue. So after talking amongst themselves for one day, they invited men to join them the second day for lectures and debate and discussion. And it's really this convention, the Seneca Falls Convention, that starts to gain momentum for the suffrage movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Frederick Douglass were both in attendance at this convention. And after this is over, they have a number of speaking engagements. They publish lectures and in newspapers and all sorts of information to start spreading the word about suffrage. And really, this is where we see the organization of nationwide and statewide suffrage groups start. So that's kind of the origin of the movement. It takes from the convention all the way up to 1920 to get the ratification process complete. So it's a more than 70-year process to get suffrage achieved for women across the United States. So after the Seneca Falls Convention, once the women's suffrage movement really starts to gain momentum, it doesn't take long before this group of women decide that they need to find a way to spread their message, to talk about what they believe in, why they think it's important, and try to convince people to agree with them. And one of the most obvious ways that they could spread this message would be by writing and printing things in the newspaper. However, they found that many male-owned and run newspapers weren't really interested in printing articles about women's suffrage. And so after being turned away a number of times, these women decided that the best way for them to achieve this goal would be to start their own newspapers. So beginning in the 1860s and all the way up through 1920, we see the establishment of suffrage newspapers across the country. Some of them cover local events and are talking really at a specific level. Others are for these national organizations and try to talk about what the movement is trying to do more broadly. Elizabeth Cady Stanton starts one of the earliest suffrage newspapers called The Revolution. And in Wisconsin, we see the Wisconsin Citizen is the Wisconsin suffrage newspaper. And this is the newspaper that's printed and published by the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association. In this newspaper, they would have talked about things like fundraising goals or talks and meetings that are happening across the state. They may have been talking about things that were happening in other states that were successful, or if women had traveled and gone to meetings in other places around the country to advocate for suffrage, they would have reported on the events of those meetings and events. So this is a really, really important vehicle for spreading the word about why women's suffrage is important. And just as there are pro-suffrage newspapers, there's also anti-suffrage printing. And one of the things that we get asked a lot is, why would anyone have been anti-suffrage? And we have to remember that the idea of equal rights wasn't a given, right, for the rest of the country. And that the anti-suffrage movement comes out of a couple of different sort of rationales. One rationale that was very common was that women's role in society was domestically based, that we were more suited for the work that took place in the home with children and with education than we were for roles of business, economics, and politics. And it was sort of called this natural division of these sort of spheres, that women fell into one sphere and men fell into the other sphere. And there were a lot of people who thought that it was inappropriate for the sort of spheres to cross. And that included women having the right to vote. And so they thought that men voted in because they were part of the political sphere and women did not. Another common rationale that was given to the anti-suffrage movement was the idea that voting for women would have been redundant. It was thought that women were represented in the vote by their husbands and their fathers, and that if you allowed women the right to vote, it was really just a redundant exercise because their fathers and husbands represented them when they cast their ballot. And the anti-suffrage movement used printing to try and get this message across the same way that the pro-suffrage movement used newspapers to publish articles as well. So I'm standing next to a picture of Teddy Roosevelt and this tiny card here. And some of you might be asking, what does Teddy Roosevelt have to do with the women's suffrage movement? Well, Teddy Roosevelt was the first presidential candidate from a major political party to run on a pro-suffrage platform. And this card is from that political campaign where he was asked by the Wisconsin suffragists to join the Political Equality League and make a pledge to vote in favor of suffrage. He signs the card, and underneath it, he includes what he hopes will be his address of Washington, D.C. And then at the bottom, he wrote a note to the women saying, "I am with you girls, heart and soul," pledging his support for suffrage in 1912. So we're standing in a space right now where we're featuring some of the women who had a significant impact on the women's suffrage movement in Wisconsin. And I'm standing close to the profiles of a couple of these ladies who had a really important role in women's suffrage in Wisconsin. So there were a lot of different strategies that were used to help women gain the right to vote. There was one group of women who advocated very strongly for an amendment at the federal level that was going to give women the right to vote across the country from the get-go. And those women had some successes and some failures, and they continued to advocate. But one of the things that kind of happened is that they discovered that they kind of needed to start at the local level and work their way up. So one of the phases of the suffrage movement during that 70-year period is what we call the state-by-state movement. And this is the idea that you can gain ground with suffrage individually, state by state. And if we can convince states to give women the right to vote in local and state elections, then eventually there will be enough momentum behind the women's suffrage movement that a federal amendment doesn't seem like such a big, scary step any longer. And so there are some.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure where the video has just gone out. Just a moment, I'm going to check on that. All right, I'm sorry. It looks like there might be an error in the video where it cuts out for about a minute, but it looks like it's going to come back. I'm sorry about that.
Then eventually there will be enough momentum behind the women's suffrage movement that a federal amendment doesn't seem like such a big, scary step any longer. And so there are some states that have a lot of success with this tactic, and other states where it's a little bit harder. Wyoming, for example, writes state suffrage into their state constitution. They write it into the constitution because they are hoping that it will attract more women to the state. And so from the very beginning of statehood, Wyoming allows women the right to vote in state elections. In other states like Kentucky and Illinois, women are granted suffrage for certain types of elections. So some places women are allowed to vote in elections related to school. In others, they're allowed to vote in sort of local municipal elections, but not the state elections. And so it's different everywhere you go. And this is a movement that sort of surprisingly has more traction with Western states than Eastern states. A lot of times when we think about American politics, we sort of think about things happening on the East Coast and then moving west. Well, the suffrage movement is really a movement where if you look at a map of the United States to see when different states grant suffrage, it is a movement that starts having success in the West and moves east. There are a lot of Eastern states who are watching Wisconsin and Michigan and other states where the settlers tended to be from traditional areas of New England to see how suffrage is perceived in these states. And I will say that in Wisconsin, the suffragists here don't have an easy task ahead of them. They have to convince a German population that really does not like the idea of how the suffrage movement is aligned with the temperance movement. They have to convince them that suffrage is a good idea for women. And that's a really, really hard thing for these women to convince them of. Also, the New Englanders that tended to settle in Wisconsin had a more traditional idea of a man's role in politics, and it was not as easy to convince them that women should have the right to vote. So for the state-by-state movement, what we see for Wisconsin is that there's a group of women who are trying to get an amendment to the state constitution to allow women to vote. And this is a pretty tricky thing because you have to get an amendment, you have to have the legislature vote on a bill at 2 consecutive sessions of the legislature and approve it. And then once it's approved by 2 consecutive sessions of the legislature, it goes to the state for a referendum vote. And once that vote happens, that is whether or not the state constitution is amended. So it takes a very long time for the suffragists of Wisconsin to get this to happen. There's a couple of failed attempts in the 1880s and 1890s, but finally in 1910 and 1911, there is an amendment that goes through the legislature and is passed in 2 consecutive sessions so that it can go to the state for a referenda in 1912. So there's a huge campaign that's devised across Wisconsin by the suffragists to try and make this referenda successful. And one of the women who's responsible for working on that referenda is a woman named Ayda James. Ayda James was from Richland Center, and she was sort of the grassroots organizer, that's what we call her today, of the 1912 referenda campaign. She printed leaflets and had them distributed at county fairs. She arranged marches and things to happen across the state. There were parades, there were stump speeches where women drove around in cars and gave talks around the state, trying to convince the men of the state to vote in favor of women's suffrage when the referenda came up for a vote. It was a very, very big movement for the state. It was a really big deal. And really, there were a lot of other states that were watching Wisconsin to see what was going to happen. It was kind of seen as, a test to whether or not it could be successful in other Eastern states. So unfortunately, the odds were stacked against Ayda, and these German brewers and the alignment with the temperance movement were not pro-suffrage, and they decided that they were not going to vote for it. And so the referendum ends up failing. It's 66% to 34% for the referenda. So it's a pretty resounding failure. And really after the failure of the 1912 referenda, what we see is that a lot of the suffragists in Wisconsin, starting in 1912, 1913, start shifting their attention away from the state-by-state movement, and they start focusing again on that federal amendment, trying to say, they realize that it's probably not going to happen in Wisconsin for them, and they need to focus their energies and attention on the federal amendment. So one of the other women that we're featuring in the exhibit is Carrie Chapman Cat. And Carrie Chapman Cat is a really well-known suffragist who is sometimes credited with designing the winning strategy for giving women the right to vote. The strategy that ends up convincing President Wilson to support the amendment and get it through the legislature in 1919. So Carrie Chapman Cat comes up with this idea along with some other suffragists that are working at the federal level to align the support of the suffrage movement with some of the motivating factors of World War I. So we have to remember that World War I is happening throughout this late period of the suffrage movement, and that there's a lot of comparison to the United States on the international stage. And there's a couple of different things that kind of come out through as World War I progresses. One is that it becomes very clear that the nation's economy is dependent on its women. Much like what we see during World War II with women going into factories and working the farms, the same things happen during World War I. And because World War I requires so many resources to keep the army fighting overseas, these women play a really, really important role in business and the economy. Now, remember when I said before that women were sort of seen as being in the home and the domestic sphere, and that they generally stayed out of business and the economy? Well, World War I is the perfect example of how women did interact with business and the economy. And the suffragists are able to use that as an argument for saying that if women do impact business and the economy, they also impact politics, and they should have the right to vote. Another factor that was part of their strategy at the time was that they looked to the allied nations that the United States had aligned themselves with. Great Britain was an American ally and had granted women suffrage. So more and more, the United States started to look a little bit backwards on the international stage, especially when it came to women's suffrage. If one of our allies had given women suffrage, there was more pressure put on the US to also give women the right to vote. So it's some of these factors that Carrie Chapman Cat used to try and convince President Wilson that the time was right for women's suffrage. And in 1919, President Wilson does formally support women's suffrage, even though he ran on a campaign just a few years before that was anti-suffrage. And so in June of 1919, the amendment is presented to the legislature, and it is approved by the federal legislature, and then it has to be sent to the states to ratify. And there's another part of the exhibit that I'm going to show you next that talks about Wisconsin's role in ratifying that amendment. So once the suffragists had done their job and they had convinced the federal government that an amendment to the Constitution was necessary, giving women the right to vote, the amendment then had to be sent out to the states for ratification. 36 states needed to approve the amendment before it could be added to the Constitution. In early June of 1919, the federal legislature voted on the amendment and approved that it go to the states. The Secretary of State then created packets of information that were sent to each state for them to consider for the voting. The packets included language about what the official language of the amendment would be, and a number of other documents that needed to be signed and sent back to Washington. Once the packets reached Wisconsin, it was then up to the governor and the legislature to vote on the amendment. And this right here is Wisconsin's copy of the 19th Amendment. So this was part of that packet of papers that was sent to Wisconsin for consideration. Now, typically in June, the legislature would not have been in session, but this year, 1919, happened to be a budget year, and the legislature was in a special session to try and pass the budget. And because they had called this special session, they were able to take up the issue of the 19th Amendment sooner than a number of other states. And so on June 10th, 1919, the state legislature voted on the 19th Amendment, and there were a number of pro-suffrage men and women who came to Madison that day so that they would be here. There's a lot of excitement about the idea that they were going to vote on the amendment. And so there's a lot of communication, and that network of suffragists is kind of working overtime. And while the legislature is in session, we get word that state of Illinois has already voted, and they voted in favor of the amendment. And shortly after, Wisconsin votes to approve the amendment as well. And there's somebody who is there in Madison at the Capitol that day who points out, it's not official until you turn your papers in at the Secretary of State's office in Washington, D.C. So if we can get our papers to D.C. faster than Illinois and Michigan, who had also voted that day, then we would be the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment. And so they looked around, they said, who could take the papers to Washington? And it turned out that David James, who was a retired state legislator, was in Madison that day, hoping to hear about the outcome of the vote. David James was the father of Ayda James and the husband of Laura James, and all three of them had been very, very active in the suffrage movement. So it seemed really appropriate that David James would be the one to take the papers to Washington. Governor Emanuel Philip issued a special order giving David James the authority to take the papers to Washington. He didn't even have time to go home and pack a bag. He took his daughter's pocketbook with him, hopped on the train, and went out to Washington to turn in our papers. When he got there, he had the clerk at the Secretary of State's office issue him a receipt. And that's in this case right here. That receipt says not only that Wisconsin had turned in their papers approving the 19th Amendment, but that Wisconsin was the first state to turn in their papers ratifying the amendment to the Constitution. David then went outside, and according to a newspaper article published a few days later, he was taking pictures with some suffragists who had come down to the Secretary of State's office to take some photos with him. And when they were standing outside, they heard the representative from Illinois come to the Secretary of State's office, run into the building to have his papers approved. And according to the story, the representative from Illinois put his papers on the table and said, "I would like to declare that Illinois is the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment," to which David James and the suffragists outside just started laughing. So Wisconsin was the first official state to ratify the amendment. It took 36 states before it could be added to the Constitution. Tennessee was the 36th state to ratify the amendment. And on August 26, 1920, the amendment was officially added to the Constitution. On that day, there was sort of an unofficial proclamation that was made that suffragists across the country rang bells and had impromptu parades and went out and sort of cheered the success of their efforts. And that is how most women in this country got the right to vote. So after the passage of the 19th Amendment, the fight for women's rights isn't over. And really, the 19th Amendment just opens the doors for women to participate in politics in a number of different ways. It's after the passage of the 19th Amendment that we first see women taking political office and holding seats in political office. Wisconsin elects its first female state legislators in 1924. There are 3 women that are elected to the state legislature then. And really from 1920 up through the 1990s and even until today, we start to see women start to be the first, right? The first woman to hold this office, the first woman to hold that office. And this trend just continues throughout the 20th century. It does go through some ebbs and flows. There's some interest in women entering politics right away in the 1920s. And then we see it kind of die off. And it's not until the civil rights movement and sort of the women's liberation movement that come in the 1960s and 70s where we see women starting to hold political office again, and those numbers start to go back up. I'm standing next to the desk that was used by Val Phillips when she held the Milwaukee Common Council seat from 1956 up through the early 60s. And really, this desk is an artifact that represents some of those firsts. Val Phillips was the first African-American woman to graduate from UW Law School. She was the first woman to hold the Common Council seat. She joined the Milwaukee judiciary in the 1960s, and she was the first African-American female judge in Milwaukee County. And she's also the first woman to hold a constitutional statewide office when she was made Secretary of State in 1978. And so we really see, through her career, how these firsts sort of took place. And it's also really important to kind of consider all those changes and things that sort of began with the passage of the 19th Amendment. There were some restrictions that still existed on voting. So we don't see Native Americans allowed to vote until 1924 with the passage of the Native American Citizenship Act. And in fact, most African Americans cannot exercise their right to vote until 1965 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act. So while the 19th Amendment opened doors for a lot of women to start participating in the political sphere, it's also important to realize that there was still a lot of fighting and rights to be gained that had to continue to be fought for throughout the 20th century. So we're standing in front of a voting booth that was used in Wisconsin between 1970 and 1990. And for thousands of Wisconsin women, this would have been the first kind of voting booth that they would have seen, that they would have used, that they would have cast their ballots in. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about this voting booth is that when it was decommissioned in 1990, that year represented sort of a peak of women's involvement in politics. If you look statistically between 1920 and 2002 at the number of women who held political office, we peak at about a third of political offices being held by women, and they reached that peak in 1990. In fact, if we look a little closer at the names of the candidates in the office in this voting booth, we'll find that exactly 1/3 of them are women that are running for election. So this voting booth represents not only the voting experience, but also women's role in politics during this part of the century. And really, this was the next goal for women as they were trying to expand women's rights and talk about issues that were important to them. It was entering political office. And they ran, homegrown grassroots campaigns just like men did at all levels of politics, and they were trying to raise awareness for a variety of issues, including equal rights. And often when we look at the campaigning and the messaging behind equal rights campaigns, or even the colors and the signs that women used when they ran for political office, there's often kind of an homage to the suffragists. They're using yellows and purples, a lot of those same colors that the suffragists wore and used when they were fighting for the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment was really a landmark amendment for so many reasons. When we designed this exhibit, we were hoping not only to show the struggle that women went through to gain the right to vote, but also some of the doors that were opened after the 19th Amendment was passed that allowed women to participate in politics. And realizing that the 19th Amendment was really, for a lot of women, just the beginning of the struggle for voting rights and participation in our political system. Probably the last example that I have to sort of talk about is the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment is something that's been debated through a lot of the 20th century. Wisconsin passes the Equal Rights Amendment in 1975, and in the lead up to the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment in Wisconsin, we see women protesting, marching, gathering, spreading information about why the amendment is important, very similar to the way that the suffragists had done it throughout the 19th century. When Wisconsin passes the Equal Rights Amendment in 1975, we're the 17th state to approve the amendment. And There's been a lot of recent talk about the Equal Rights Amendment because the last state needed to ratify the amendment recently held a vote on it. And so it's just a great example about how the political process, the involvement of women, and the role of equal rights is still an ongoing thing that we're still talking about today. Thanks for joining us on this virtual tour of We Stand on Their Shoulders. I hope that it has been interesting and helps people understand the role of the suffrage movement and how Wisconsin fit into that important decision.
All right, so that is the conclusion of the video. I hope you all enjoyed it and maybe learned some things. And I think we're gonna open it up to Q&A now. Oh, you're on mute.
I'm on mute. Here I am. You can send in questions either via the Q&A feature or the chat feature. I'll monitor both queues. And while we're waiting, Laurel, thanks so much. This was really interesting. I took a couple pages of notes, a lot of things I didn't know, so it was very interesting.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I know I have learned so much since, especially since last year when we started commemorating the women's suffrage movement in Wisconsin. So I'm still sort of a student too. I'm still learning a lot.
Hi, this is Ayda. I'm wondering, since you sent me when we were going through the preparation for this, if the script might be available for people to see.
Oh, that's a great question. So I will check in with Simone and see if that's something that we can make available sort of to the public. Right now, I don't think we have a version of that, but I'll check in about that.
Okay, great. Thank
someone
you.
asked how other people can see this video and where will it be available?
Yeah, another great question. So I believe right now it's also, I don't think it's publicly available, but again, I can check in about that and get back to you about it.
And as far as this particular video that has the video inside of our video, that will be available on our website at the Plato website at some point. We're trying to figure out where to put these and stuff, but it will be eventually available. So you can always watch it within this bigger video that we're doing today. So
yes, that's right. And I should say that the Wisconsin Historical Society does have a YouTube channel where we have a number of other sort of shorter videos that we did in the exhibition talking about different themes, some of the ones that didn't get covered in this video. And those are also available on our Facebook page.
Laurel, was the tour that was done, did that include the whole exhibit? I mean, it's huge. It must take up a lot of space.
Yeah, it is a big exhibition. So it covers all of the spaces and all of the themes of the exhibition, but there are so many more stories that just, wouldn't have fit into a tour of that length. I mean, we could spend hours talking about it. And there are some, I think, some artifacts that maybe you didn't get to see quite up close. So there's definitely some more to explore in there.
Great. Doesn't sound like there might be a question. So
anybody else have a question?
Okay. Well, then I think we'll wrap up our lecture for today. Again, thanks so much for joining us, everybody. And I want to point out, since we're talking about voting and elections, etc., remind you to probably vote in person. It's a little late now to mail in your ballot, but I think it's important for you to exercise that right that these women that we just watched fought so hard to attain for us to have that privilege. So I encourage you to do that. And then I want to say, we've got a couple of extra other coming up lectures that you might be interested in. Dennis Driesing, who does the, excuse me, Wither the State lecture at 10 o'clock on Tuesdays. On November 10th, we'll be doing a recap of the election. So if you're not a member of the class, it doesn't matter. But if you'd like to join that particular class, please register on our website. Excuse me, I had to take a sip of water. The next lecture is November 18th from 1 to 2. It's a look at the administration of Governor Pat Lucey. Also by Dennis Dreesing, who has written a comprehensive book on the subject. Again, be sure to register for that. Excuse my voice. Excuse me. And another lecture we're doing is on December 3rd. It's called the Hoogie Health and Happiness Lecture. And it's a lecture on the Danish way of celebrating health and happiness. So boy, will that be a good time to hear a lecture like that. So another thing is I'd like to say, if you have suggestions for lecture topics, please send them to info@platomadison.org. Again, thanks Laurel so much to you for working with us to put on this lecture on We Stand on Their Shoulders, a woman's right to vote. It was fascinating and interesting, thanks to the State Historical Society. And thank you all for being with us. We look forward to, quote, seeing you at the next lecture. Bye now.